Every night, you willingly enter one of the strangest psychological states humans ever experience. For several hours, your body becomes temporarily paralyzed. Your mind begins generating vivid internal realities that can feel astonishingly real. You may run from something terrifying, speak to someone who no longer exists, fall endlessly through empty space, or find yourself in situations so bizarre they would make no sense in waking life. And then, by morning, most of it quietly disappears. It's a strangely universal human experience. Almost everyone has dreamed of being chased, of falling, of arriving somewhere unprepared, embarrassed, exposed, of seeing impossible combinations of people, places, and events woven together as though the mind had briefly abandoned the normal rules of reality. Some people even dream solutions to problems they could not solve while awake, which raises an unsettling question. Why does the brain do this? Because dreams sound irrational, disorganized, emotionally exaggerated, sometimes absurd, and yet modern psychology and neuroscience suggest they may be doing something surprisingly important. Your sleeping brain may be processing unresolved emotions, rehearsing possible dangers, reorganizing memory, testing social situations, generating creative connections your waking mind would never consider. Some theories even suggest dreaming may help protect parts of the brain itself. In other words, what feels like mental nonsense may be part of a remarkably functional system. And perhaps that is what makes dreaming so psychologically fascinating. It sits at the strange intersection of biology, memory, emotion, imagination, and survival. A place where the mind becomes both storyteller and subject. A place where logic loosens, but meaning may still remain. For centuries, humans believed dreams were messages from gods, symbols from the unconscious, or glimpses into hidden truths. Today, science offers more grounded explanations, but not certainty. And the strangest part is, science still doesn't fully agree. Because even after everything we've learned about the human brain, dreams remain one of its most intimate and unresolved mysteries. Something we all experience, something we barely understand, and perhaps something that reveals more about the human mind than we realize. To understand why dreams feel so strange, we first need to understand that dreaming is not simply imagination. It is a distinct biological altered state. When you dream, your brain is not quietly resting in the background. In some ways, it becomes extraordinarily active, just active in a very different configuration than waking consciousness. The stage most closely associated with vivid dreaming is REM sleep, short for rapid eye movement. During this phase, something unusual happens. Behind closed eyelids, your eyes move rapidly as though they are tracking events in an external world. Brain activity becomes intense, in some cases resembling waking states, and yet your body remains largely immobile. This temporary paralysis is not a malfunction, it is a protective mechanism. The brainstem essentially inhibits major muscle movement, preventing the body from physically acting out dream scenarios. Without it, a nightmare about running might become actual movement across your bedroom floor. At the same time, the visual regions of the brain become highly active, helping generate vivid internal imagery. This is why dreams can feel astonishingly immersive. The emotional textures, colors, places, and people often feel immediate and convincing, even when the content itself is deeply irrational. Which brings us to one of dreaming's strangest psychological features, reduced logic. During REM sleep, the prefrontal cortex, the area associated with reasoning, critical thinking, and reality testing, becomes less active. This means your usual internal editor grows quieter, and that changes everything. In waking life, you would immediately question impossible scenarios. Why am I suddenly in my childhood home with my college professor? Why is gravity behaving strangely? Why am I calmly having dinner with someone who died years ago? But in dreams, these contradictions rarely feel alarming, because the part of the brain that would normally challenge them is partially offline. And finally, there is weak memory encoding. The neurochemical conditions of dreaming are not ideal for forming stable long-term memories, which is why dreams often dissolve so quickly after waking. So the paradox becomes clear. Your brain creates a temporary alternate reality, and it feels real precisely because the systems designed to question reality are temporarily subdued. But this leads to an even stranger question. Why do we accept such absurd dream scenarios so effortlessly? Why can you be calmly having a conversation with a childhood friend inside an airport that somehow looks exactly like your old school cafeteria, while a talking dog gives you relationship advice, and none of this feels particularly concerning? In waking life, even minor inconsistencies trigger immediate skepticism. But in dreams, the impossible often feels perfectly normal. Part of the answer lies in the emotional architecture of the dreaming brain. During REM sleep, while rational oversight becomes quieter, emotionally driven regions remain highly active. One especially important structure is the amygdala, the brain region deeply involved in emotional salience, fear processing, and emotional memory. In simple terms, your emotional brain remains very much awake. Sometimes, even more active than usual. This creates a fascinating imbalance. Emotion stays online, logic softens, and when those two systems become uneven, experience changes dramatically. This helps explain why dreams often feel emotionally intense, even when their narratives are bizarre. A harmless social interaction can suddenly feel devastatingly embarrassing. A vague sense of being followed can become overwhelming terror. A reunion with someone long gone can feel profoundly real and emotionally moving. This is emotional amplification. The dreaming brain does not always care whether a story is logically coherent. It cares whether it feels emotionally significant. And because rational evaluation is quieter, emotional logic takes over. The dream does not ask, "Does this make sense?" It asks, "What does this feel like?" That distinction matters, because dreams may be less like stories constructed through reason and more like emotional experiences assembled from fragments of memory, sensation, fear, longing, and imagination. This may also explain why dreams sometimes seem to dramatize unresolved emotions rather than accurately represent reality. The setting may be nonsense. The emotional truth may not be. And perhaps that is why dreams can linger with us even after the details fade. Not because we remember the storyline clearly, but because the feeling remains. A strange sadness, anxiety, relief, wonder. Dreams may be irrational on the surface, but emotionally, they often speak in a language the waking mind still recognizes. Up to this point, dreaming may sound like a fascinating biological performance, a sleeping brain generating vivid imagery, an emotional system running without its usual rational supervision, a temporary alternate reality that feels convincing because critical thinking has been dialed down. But understanding how dreams happen is only part of the story. The deeper question is far more compelling. Why does the brain do this at all? Why would evolution preserve a process that consumes energy, disrupts full rest, creates bizarre hallucination-like experiences, and occasionally wakes us in distress? At first glance, dreaming seems strangely inefficient. If sleep is supposed to restore the body, why introduce an elaborate internal theater filled with emotional chaos and surreal storytelling? And this is where the mystery becomes much more interesting, because despite decades of neuroscience, psychology, brain imaging, and sleep research, science still does not offer a single definitive answer. There is no universally accepted explanation that fully accounts for why humans dream. Instead, there are multiple theories, each compelling in different ways, each explaining part of the puzzle. And perhaps that uncertainty says something important. Dreaming may not exist for only one reason. The human brain rarely wastes complex systems on a single function. Breathing regulates oxygen, but also influences emotion and nervous system state. Memory helps us store information, but also shapes identity. Emotion warns us of danger, but also guides relationships and meaning. Dreaming may be similarly multifunctional, a process that serves several overlapping purposes at once. Some researchers believe dreams help organize and strengthen memory. Others see them as emotional rehearsal spaces, where the mind simulates threats or difficult social situations. Some suggest dreams foster creativity by loosening logical constraints and allowing unusual connections. Others propose something even stranger, that dreaming may help protect parts of the brain itself from neural takeover during long periods of darkness. These ideas are very different, yet each reflects the same deeper assumption. Dreaming is probably not random, even if it appears chaotic, and perhaps that is what makes dreams so psychologically intriguing. They feel irrational from the inside. But from the perspective of evolution, irrationality is rarely enough to survive for millions of years. So if the brain keeps dreaming, night after night, there is likely a reason. We just may not fully understand all of it yet. One of the most widely supported explanations for dreaming is surprisingly practical. Dreams may help the brain organize memory, not in the poetic sense of decoding hidden meaning, but in the biological sense of processing information. If you think about an ordinary waking day, the amount of input your brain receives is staggering. Conversations, faces, emails, fragments of music, stressful interactions, something you studied for work, a phrase in a language you're trying to learn, a strange expression on someone's face that you only half noticed. The brain cannot keep everything. So one influential theory suggests that during sleep, and especially during dreaming, The mind begins sorting through this mental accumulation. Like a librarian staying late after closing time. Books are scattered everywhere. Some are important and need to be archived carefully. Some belong in temporary storage. Others are irrelevant and quietly discarded. The dreaming brain may be doing something similar. Sorting, storing, deleting, strengthening certain neural connections while allowing others to fade. This helps explain why sleep is so deeply connected to learning. If you spend the day studying difficult material, practicing a skill, or absorbing unfamiliar information, sleep often improves performance afterward. Not because you consciously kept working, but because your brain may have continued processing in the background. The same may be true for learning a language. Vocabulary that feels slippery before bed can feel slightly more familiar the next day. Pronunciation becomes smoother. Patterns begin to settle. Even social experiences may be processed this way. An awkward conversation, a difficult emotional interaction, a subtle social cue you didn't fully understand in the moment. Dreaming may help the brain revisit, reorganize, and integrate these experiences, which makes dreams less like random entertainment and more like overnight mental housekeeping. Of course, this does not mean every bizarre dream contains a direct symbolic message. A dream about your dentist teaching philosophy on a moving train may not require interpretation, but the underlying process may still be meaningful because the brain does not necessarily preserve experience in clean, logical formats. It works associatively, emotionally, fragment by fragment. And perhaps dreams are what memory looks like, while the mind is still deciding what deserves to stay. Another compelling theory suggests that some dreams are not about organizing the past. They may be about preparing for the future. This is known as threat simulation theory. The idea that dreaming gives the brain a safe environment to rehearse dangerous situations before they happen in real life. At first, this may sound surprisingly mechanical, but if you think about the kinds of dreams many people report, it begins to feel strangely plausible. Being chased, falling from impossible heights, running but somehow moving too slowly, trying to escape danger while the body feels heavy and unresponsive, waking from a nightmare with your heart racing, even though nothing in the room has changed. These dreams can feel irrational, but emotionally they are remarkably consistent. Threat, urgency, fear, survival. From an evolutionary perspective, this raises an interesting possibility. For much of human history, danger was not abstract. Predators, violence, environmental threats, social exclusion, which in early human groups could be life-threatening in its own way. A brain capable of mentally rehearsing threat scenarios even during sleep might have gained an adaptive advantage. Not because dreams predict the future, but because rehearsal strengthens readiness. The same way athletes mentally visualize performance, the sleeping brain may simulate emotionally charged scenarios to practice response patterns. This shifts how we think about nightmares. Perhaps they are not merely emotional disturbances. Perhaps some are forms of survival training. A virtual simulation where no physical harm occurs, but emotional systems still engage. And this becomes even more psychologically interesting when we consider modern life. Most people are not running from predators. Yet threat still exists, just in different forms. Emotional rejection, failure, loss of control, embarrassment. The brain may still use ancient mechanisms to rehearse contemporary fears, which suggests dreaming may not only be physical survival practice. It may be emotional practice too, a place where the mind experiments with fear in symbolic form, not always elegantly, not always logically, but perhaps functionally. Because if waking life asks us to navigate uncertainty, vulnerability, and emotional threat, then dreaming may be one of the ways the mind quietly prepares us, even if the rehearsal arrives disguised as chaos. But human survival has changed. For most of our evolutionary history, danger often meant something immediate and physical. Today, many of the threats that shape emotional life are less visible. Social humiliation, rejection, failure, abandonment, loss of belonging. And psychologically, these experiences can feel far more threatening than we sometimes admit, because the human brain did not evolve only to avoid physical harm. It evolved to preserve connection, to remain accepted within social groups, to avoid exclusion, which may explain why so many modern dreams are not about predators, but about emotional exposure. Standing in front of a crowd, suddenly unable to speak, arriving somewhere important completely unprepared, realizing you are in public in an embarrassing state of vulnerability, running into an ex in a setting that feels emotionally charged and strangely surreal, reliving awkward conversations, failing publicly, being ignored, being judged. These dreams can feel deeply uncomfortable, sometimes even more distressing than classic nightmares, because they touch something profoundly human, the fear of emotional pain. From this perspective, dreaming may not simply rehearse physical survival, it may rehearse social survival. The sleeping brain may be simulating emotionally threatening situations, not because it enjoys distress, but because rehearsal can create familiarity, and familiarity can reduce uncertainty. This helps explain why dreams often exaggerate social discomfort so dramatically. The emotional brain tends to amplify what matters. And for social creatures like us, belonging matters enormously. A public speaking nightmare may not be about speaking itself. It may be about fear of exposure. An awkward dream about an ex may not be about that specific person. It may reflect unresolved themes of rejection, regret, longing, or emotional vulnerability. Dreams often translate emotional concerns into strange symbolic scenarios because the dreaming mind is less interested in literal accuracy than emotional relevance, which makes dreaming feel less like random cinema and more like emotional rehearsal. A strange overnight simulation where the mind experiments with discomfort, not always to solve it, not always to heal it, but perhaps to repeatedly engage with emotional uncertainty in ways waking consciousness cannot fully control. Because if modern survival increasingly depends on navigating complex emotional and social realities, then perhaps dreams have evolved alongside us, becoming not just rehearsals for danger, but rehearsals for heartbreak, embarrassment, and the deeply human fear of not belonging. Not all dreams are about fear, memory, or emotional rehearsal. Some may serve a very different function, creativity. There is a curious pattern throughout history. Moments of insight arriving not through deliberate effort, but through dreaming. Paul McCartney famously described waking with the melody of yesterday already formed in his mind, as though the song had arrived from somewhere beyond conscious thought. Chemist Auguste Kekulé reportedly struggled for years to understand the structure of benzene, until a dream of a snake curling into a circle suggested the ring-shaped model that transformed chemistry. Whether every historical detail is perfectly preserved matters less than the psychological pattern they represent. Sometimes, the dreaming mind appears capable of solving problems the waking mind could not. Why? Because the dream brain thinks differently. In waking life, thought is often constrained by logic, rules, expectations, and familiar pathways. This is enormously useful for everyday functioning, but it can also become restrictive. We become attached to conventional solutions. We repeat familiar patterns. We think inside established structures. Dreaming alters that balance. Logical inhibition decreases. Associative freedom increases. The rational reality testing parts of the brain become quieter, while more fluid networks of imagery, memory, and emotional association remain active. As a result, ideas that would seem unrelated in waking consciousness may suddenly connect. A scientific problem becomes a symbolic image. An unresolved question becomes a strange narrative. A melody emerges without obvious effort. This does not mean dreams are magical messages, but it may mean that creativity sometimes benefits from loosened control. Psychologically, this is fascinating, because many creative breakthroughs do not come from forcing harder, but from temporarily stepping outside rigid modes of thinking. Dreams may provide exactly that, a mental environment where logic relaxes enough for unusual combinations to surface. Of course, most dreams do not produce world-changing discoveries. Many are chaotic, forgettable, or emotionally confusing, but even that supports the larger idea. Creativity is rarely neat. It often emerges from experimentation, randomness, and unexpected association. And perhaps dreaming is one of the mind's most private creative laboratories, a place where thought becomes less disciplined, but sometimes more imaginative. A strange internal space where the brain stops asking what is reasonable and begins exploring what is possible. And then there is perhaps the strangest theory of all, one that shifts dreaming from psychology into something almost biological warfare. It's called defensive activation theory, and its premise is unexpectedly elegant. To understand it, imagine the brain not as a peaceful collection of neatly assigned regions, but as living territory. Dynamic, competitive, constantly adapting. The brain is highly plastic, which means its regions are not permanently fixed in their functions. If one area becomes inactive for too long, neighboring systems may begin to repurpose that unused space. In other words, inactivity creates opportunity. Now consider something simple. Every night for hours you close your eyes. The visual cortex, the part of the brain responsible for processing sight, suddenly receives almost no external visual input. From an evolutionary perspective, that presents an interesting problem. If the brain dislikes unused territory, What happens to the visual system during prolonged darkness? According to this theory, dreaming may be the brain's solution, a kind of internal defense mechanism, a neural screensaver. Every so often during sleep, bursts of internally generated visual imagery activate the visual cortex, not necessarily because the brain wants to entertain you, but because it wants to keep that territory occupied, active, protected. As if the visual cortex is quietly saying to neighboring regions, "I'm still here. This space is taken." There is something almost cinematic about this idea. While you sleep peacefully, a silent territorial battle may be unfolding inside your skull, not between thoughts, but between brain systems competing for relevance. Dreams in this framing are not symbolic messages, not emotional confessions, not creative poetry, at least not primarily. They may be maintenance, defense, biological self-preservation. Of course, this remains a theory, not settled scientific consensus. But what makes it so compelling is how radically it reframes the experience of dreaming. What feels mystical may be brutally practical. What feels emotionally strange may have emerged from evolutionary efficiency. And even if this explanation accounts for only part of dreaming, it reveals something profound about the brain itself. It is never idle. Even in sleep, it is adapting, protecting, reorganizing, fighting quiet battles we never consciously witness, which perhaps makes dreams feel even stranger. Because what if the stories we experience at night are not only psychological experiences, but side effects of the brain protecting itself in darkness? No exploration of dreams feels complete without mentioning Sigmund Freud. For much of the 20th century, Freud shaped how people thought about dreaming more than almost anyone else. His central idea was provocative. Dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. In other words, dreams reveal hidden wishes, repressed desires, and parts of the self that waking consciousness keeps out of view. Later, Carl Jung expanded this perspective, suggesting dreams also contain symbolic patterns that reflect deeper psychological themes shared across humanity. Modern neuroscience, however, has challenged many of these claims. Freud's specific symbolic interpretations often do not hold up scientifically. Dreams do not appear to operate through universal secret codes waiting to be neatly decoded. A dream about missing a train is not necessarily about fear of missed opportunity. A strange object is not automatically disguised desire. The brain is far messier, more associative, and less symbolically tidy than early psychoanalytic theories assumed. And yet, dismissing Freud entirely may miss something psychologically important. Because while the symbolic mechanics may have been overstated, the deeper question remains compelling. Do dreams reflect emotional concerns we carry while awake? Modern research would suggest sometimes, yes, not because dreams contain precise hidden messages, but because emotional themes often seem to persist. Stressful periods can produce more anxiety-laden dreams. Relationship uncertainty may show up in emotionally charged social scenarios. Grief can bring dreams of lost loved ones that feel intensely meaningful, regardless of whether they mean anything in a literal interpretive sense. The dreaming mind may not be sending encrypted psychological telegrams, but it does seem capable of reworking emotionally significant material, perhaps less like symbolism, more like emotional echo, fragments of fear, longing, conflict, memory, unfinished emotional business. So Freud may have been wrong in many specifics, but perhaps he was asking a psychologically enduring question. Not what secret code does this dream contain, but something quieter. What emotional realities continue speaking when conscious control falls asleep? And that question still feels worth asking. After moving through all of these theories, perhaps the most honest conclusion is also the least satisfying. Dreams may not exist for one single reason. Human beings often prefer neat explanations. One cause, one purpose, one elegant answer, but the brain rarely works that way. Its systems overlap, functions evolve. Mechanisms that begin for one purpose are often repurposed for others. So perhaps the question is not which theory is correct, but rather how many of them might be partially true at the same time. Dreams may be biological, a byproduct of sleep architecture and neural activity. They may be psychological, a reflection of emotional themes, unresolved tensions, or the mind's associative nature. They may be involved in emotional processing, helping us revisit emotionally charged experiences in strange, symbolic, or fragmented forms. They may support creativity, loosening the rigid structures of waking thought just enough for unusual connections to emerge. They may even serve survival functions, rehearsing threat, simulating social risk, or protecting vulnerable brain systems during sleep. Perhaps dreaming is not one thing, Perhaps dreaming is what happens when a highly adaptive brain uses the unusual conditions of sleep to accomplish several different tasks at once. And if that is true, it says something quietly profound about the human mind. Even in apparent stillness, it remains astonishingly active, meaning-making, reorganizing, protecting, experimenting, feeling. There is something deeply human in that, because dreams are not clean, efficient processes. They are messy, emotional, surreal, contradictory, much like consciousness itself. And perhaps that is why dreams continue to fascinate us. Not simply because they are strange, but because they feel like glimpses into a version of the mind we rarely encounter while awake. Less controlled, less rational, but perhaps not less meaningful. Maybe dreams are not messages, maybe they are processes, or maybe they are both, depending on the night. The most psychologically honest answer may simply be this. Dreams are one of the many ways the brain continues being deeply, mysteriously alive, even when the conscious self has temporarily stepped away. And perhaps the enduring mystery is part of their meaning. Not everything the mind does is fully meant to be understood. At least not yet. After everything we've explored, perhaps the most honest conclusion is not certainty, but humility. Dreams may be irrational stories, a strange collage of impossible places, distorted memories, unfinished conversations, emotional fragments, and images that make little sense in the light of day. And yet, irrational does not mean meaningless. Not everything meaningful arrives in neat, logical language. The brain rarely communicates only through orderly explanation. Sometimes it works through emotion, through association, through symbolism we did not consciously choose, through strange internal narratives that feel confusing on the surface, but leave behind emotions that feel unmistakably real. Perhaps that is why dreams continue to stay with us. Not because we can always explain them, but because something about them feels psychologically familiar. A fear we recognize, a longing we had forgotten, a memory reshaped into something stranger, or simply the unsettling awareness that even while we sleep, the mind remains active in ways we barely understand. And maybe that is the deeper fascination. Dreams remind us that consciousness is not as simple as waking thought, that the self we know during the day is only one version of the mind. Because somewhere beneath logic, beneath language, beneath deliberate control, the brain continues doing what it has always done. Processing, protecting, rehearsing, imagining, feeling. The brain often speaks in strange languages, and perhaps dreams are one of its oldest dialects. So here's something worth wondering about tonight. When you dream, is your mind escaping reality, or quietly trying to help you survive it? And if there's one thing dreams reveal, it may be this. Even in our most passive moments, the human mind is anything but passive. It remains mysterious, creative, emotional, deeply alive. So now I'm curious. What's the strangest dream you still remember? The one that made no sense but somehow stayed with you. The one that felt disturbingly real. The one you still think about years later, even though you can't explain why. Some dreams disappear by morning, but some leave footprints. Deep Ravines Lab Protocol. Characters and stories are AI generated for motivational insights. 2. Content is curated for entertainment and exploring the messiness of human psyche. 3. No proselytizing or harmful content.